Complexion by Richard Rodriguez. Complexion is an excerpt from Hunger of Memory, an extended autobiographical essay describing the author's coming of age as the son of Mexican immigrants to the United States. Visiting the East Coast or the gray capitals of Europe during the long months of winter, I often meet people at deluxe hotels who comment on my complexion. In such hotels, it appears nowadays a mark of leisure and wealth to have a complexion like mine. Have I been skiing in the Swiss Alps? Have I just returned from a Caribbean vacation? No. I say no softly, but in a firm voice that intends to explain. My complexion is dark. My skin is brown, more exactly terracotta in sunlight, tawny in shade. I do not redden in sunlight. Instead, my skin becomes progressively dark. The sun singes the flesh. When I was a boy, the white summer sun of Sacramento would darken me so my t-shirt would seem bleached against my slender, dark arms. My mother would see me come up the front steps. She'd wait for the screen door to slam at my back. "You look like a negrito," she'd say. Angry. Sorry to be angry. Frustrated, almost to laughing. Scorn. "You know how important looks are in this country. With Los Gringos, looks are all that they judge on. But you, look at you. You're so careless." Then she'd start in all over again. "You won't be satisfied till you end up looking like los pobres who work in the fields. Los braceros. Los braceros. Those men who work with their brazos, their arms. Mexican nationals who were licensed to work for American farmers." 50s. They worked very hard for very little money, my father would tell me, and what money they earned they sent back to Mexico to support their families. My mother would add, "Los pobres, the poor, the pitiful, the powerless ones," but paradoxically also powerful men. They were the men with brown muscled arms I stared at in awe on Saturday mornings when they showed up downtown like gypsies to shop at Woolworth's or Penny's. On Monday nights they would gather hours early on the steps of the Memorial Auditorium for the wrestling matches. Passing by on my bicycle in summer, I would spy them there, clustered in small groups, talking. Frightening and fascinating men, some wearing Texas sombreros and t-shirts which shone fluorescent in the twilight. I would sit forward in the back seat of our family's '48 Chevy to see them, working alongside valley highways, dark men on an even horizon, loading a truck amid rows of straight green. Powerful, powerless men. Their fascinating darkness, like mine, to be feared. "You'll end up looking just like them." Regarding my family, I see faces that do not closely resemble my own. Like some other Mexican families, my family suggests Mexico's confused colonial past. Gathered around a table, we appear to be from separate continents. My father's face recalls faces I have seen in France. His complexion is white. He does not tan. He does not burn. Over the years, his dark, wavy hair has grayed handsomely, but with time his face has sagged to a perpetual sigh. My mother, whose surname is inexplicably Irish, Moran, has an olive complexion. People have frequently wondered if, perhaps, she is Italian or Portuguese, and in fact she looks as though she could be from southern Europe. My mother's face has not aged as quickly as the rest of her body. It remains smooth and glowing, a cool tan, which her gray hair cleanly accentuates. My older brother has inherited her good looks. When he was a boy, people would tell him that he looked like Mario Lanza, and hearing it, he would smile with dimpled assurance. He would come home from high school with girlfriends who seemed to me glamorous blondes. And during those years I envied him his skin that burned red and peeled like the skin of the gringos. His complexion never darkened like mine. My youngest sister is exotically pale, almost ashen. She is delicately featured, Near Eastern, people have said. Only my older sister has a complexion as dark as mine, though her facial features are much less harshly defined than my own. To many people meeting her, she seems, they say, Polynesian. I am the only one in the family whose face is severely cut to the line of ancient Indian ancestors. My face is mournfully long, in the classical Indian manner. My profile suggests one of those beak-nosed Mayan sculptures, the eagle-like face upturned, open-mouthed against the deserted, primitive sky. "We are Mexicans," my mother and father would say, and taught their 4 children to say whenever often, were asked about our ancestry. My mother and father scorned those white Mexican Americans who tried to pass themselves off as Spanish. My parents would never have thought of denying their ancestry. I never denied it. My ancestry is Mexican, I told strangers mechanically, but I never forgot that only my older sister's complexion was as dark as mine. My older sister never spoke to me about her complexion when she was a girl, but I guessed that she found her dark skin a burden. I knew that she suffered for being a "nigger." As she came home from grammar school, little boys came up behind her and pushed her down to the sidewalk. In high school, she struggled in the adolescent competition for boyfriends in a world of football games and proms, a world where her looks were plainly uncommon. In college, she was afraid and scornful when dark-skinned foreign students from countries like Turkey and India found her attractive. She revealed her fear of dark skin to me only in adulthood when, regarding her own 3 children, she quietly admitted relief that they were all light. That is the kind of remark women in my family have often made before. As a boy, I'd stay in the kitchen, never seeming to attract any notice, listening while my aunts spoke of their pleasure at having light children. The men, some of whom were dark skinned, of working out of doors, would be in another part of the house. It was the woman's spoken concern, the fear of having a dark skinned son or daughter. Remedies were exchanged. One aunt prescribed to her sisters the elixir of large doses of castor oil during the last weeks of pregnancy. The remedy risked an abortion. Children born dark grew up to have their faces treated regularly with a mixture of egg white and lemon juice concentrate. In my case, the solution never would take. One Mexican American friend of my mother's, who regarded it a special blessing that she had a measure of English blood, spoke disparagingly of her husband, a construction worker, for being so dark. "He doesn't take care of himself," she complained. But the remark, I noticed, annoyed my mother, who sat tracing an invisible design with her finger on the tablecloth. There was affection, too, and a kind of humor about these matters. With daring tenderness, one of my uncles would refer to his wife as "mi negra." An aunt regularly called her dark child "mi fieto," my little ugly one, her smile only partially hidden as she bent down to dig her mouth under his ticklish chin. And at times relatives spoke scornfully of pale, white skin. "A gringo's skin resembled masa (baker's dough)," someone remarked. Everyone laughed. Voices chuckled over the fact that the gringos spent so many hours in summer sunning themselves. They need to get sun because they look like los muertos. I heard the laughing, but remembered what the women had said with unsmiling voices concerning dark skin. Nothing I heard outside the house regarding my skin was so impressive to me. In public I occasionally heard racial slurs. Complete strangers would yell out to me. A teenager drove past, shouting, "Hey, greaser! Hey, Pancho!" over his shoulder. I saw the giggling face of his girlfriend. A pale boy pedaled and announced matter-of-factly, "I pee on dirty Mexicans." Such remarks would be said so casually that I wouldn't quickly realize that they were being addressed to me. When I did, I would be paralyzed with embarrassment, to return the insult. Those times I happened to be with white grammar school friends, they shouted back, imbued with the mysterious kindness of children. My friends would never ask later why I hadn't yelled out in my own defense. In all, there could not have been more than a dozen incidences of name calling. That there were so few suggests that I was not a primary victim of racial abuse, but that even today I can clearly remember particular incidences is proof of their impact. Because of such incidents, I listened when my parents remarked that Mexicans were often mistreated in California border towns. And in Texas, I listened carefully when I heard that two of my cousins had been refused admittance to an all white swimming pool, and that an uncle had been told by some man to, quote, go back to Africa. I followed the progress of the Southern Black Civil Rights Movement, which was gaining prominent notice in Sacramento's afternoon newspaper. But what most intrigued me was the connection between dark skin and poverty, because I heard my mother speak so often about the relegation of dark people to menial labor. I considered the great victims of racism to be those who were poor and forced to do menial work, people like the farm workers whose skin was dark from the sun. After meeting a black grammar school friend of my sister's, I remember thinking that she wasn't really black. What interested me was the fact that she wasn't poor. Her well dressed parents would come by after work to pick her up in a shiny green Oldsmobile. By contrast, the garbage men who appeared every Friday morning seemed to me unmistakably black. I don't bother to ask my parents why Sacramento garbage men always were black. I thought I knew. One morning I was in the backyard when a man opened the gate. He was an ugly, square-faced black man with popping red eyes, a pail slung over his shoulder. As he approached, I stood up, and in a voice that seemed to me very weak, I piped, "Hi," but the man paid me no heed. Passed to the can by the garage. In a single broad movement, he overturned its contents into his larger pail. Our can came crushing down as he turned and left me watching in awe. Pobres negros, my mother remarked when she noticed a headline in the newspaper about a civil rights demonstration in the South. How the gringos mistreat them. In the same tone of voice, she'd tell me about the mistreatment her brother endured years before. After my grandfather's death, my grandmother had come to America with her son and 5 daughters. My sisters, we were still all just teenagers, and since me papa was dead, my brother had to be the head of the family. He had to support us, to find work. But what skills did he have? 20 years old. Pobre. He was tall, like your grandfather, and strong. He did construction work. Construction. The gringos kept him digging all day, doing the dirtiest jobs, and they would pay him next to nothing. Sometimes they promised him one salary, and paid him less when he finished. But what could he do? Report them? We weren't citizens then. He didn't even know English. And he was dark. What chances could he have? As soon as we sisters got older, he went right back to Mexico. He hated this country. He looked so tired when he left. Already with a hunchback. Still in his 20s. But old looking. No life for him here. Pobre. Dark skin was for my mother the most important symbol of a life of oppressive labor and poverty. But both my parents recognized other symbols as well. My father noticed the feel of every hand he shook. He'd smile sometimes, marvel more than scorn, remembering a man he'd met who had soft, uncalloused hands. My mother would grab a towel in the kitchen and rub my oily face sore when I came in from playing outside. Clean the grazza off your face. Greaser. Symbols. When my older sister, then in high school, asked my mother if she could do light housework in the afternoons for a rich lady we knew, my mother was frightened by the idea. For several weeks she troubled over it before granting conditional permission. Remember, you're not a maid. I don't want you wearing a uniform. My father echoed the same warning. Walking with him past a hotel, I watched as he stared at a doorman dressed like a beefeater. How can anyone let himself be dressed up like that? Like a clown. Don't you ever get a job where you have to put on a uniform. In summertime, neighbors would ask me if I wanted to earn extra money by mowing their lawns. Again and again my mother worried, why did they ask you? Can't you find anything better? Inevitably, she'd relent. She knew I needed the money, but I was instructed to work after dinner, when the sun's not so hot. Even then, I'd have to wear a hat. Un sombrero de baseball. Sombrero. Watching gray cowboy movies, I'd brood over the meaning of the broad-rimmed hat, that troubling symbol which comically distinguished a Mexican cowboy from real cowboys. My father From my father came no warnings concerning the son. His fear was of dark factory jobs. He remembered too well his first jobs when he came to this country, not intending to stay, just to earn enough money to sail on to Australia. In Mexico he had heard too many stories of discrimination in Los Estados Unidos. So it was Australia, that distant island continent that loomed in his imagination as his America. The work my father found in San Francisco was work for the unskilled, a factory job, then a cannery job. He'd remember the noise and the heat. Then a job at a warehouse. He'd remember the dark stench of old urine. At one place there were fistfights. At another a supervisor who hated Chinese and Mexicans. Nowhere a union. His memory of himself in those years is held by those jobs, never making money enough for passage to Australia, slowly giving up the plan of returning to school to resume his third-grade education, to become an engineer. My memory of him in those years, however, is lifted from photographs in the family album, which show him on his honeymoon with my mother, the woman who had convinced him to stay in America. I have studied their photographs often, seeking to find in those figures a resemblance to the man and the woman I've known as my parents. But the youthful faces in the photos remain behind dark glasses, shadowy figures anticipating my mother and father. They are pictured on the grounds of the Coronado Hotel near San Diego, standing in the pale light of a winter afternoon. She is wearing slacks. Her hair falls seductively over one side of her face. He appears wearing a double-breasted suit, an unneeded raincoat draped over his arm. Another shows them standing together, solemnly staring ahead. Their shoulders barely are touching. There is to their pose an aristocratic formality, an elegant Latin hauteur. The man in those pictures is the same man who was fascinated by Italian grand opera. I have never known just what my father saw in the spectacle, but he has told me that he would take my mother to the opera house every Friday night if he had money enough for orchestra seats. Why go to sit in the balcony? On Sundays he'd don Italian silk scarves and a camel's hair coat to take his new wife to the polo matches in Golden Gate Park. But one weekend my father stopped going to the opera and polo matches. He would blame the change in his life on one job, a warehouse job, working for a large corporation which today advertises its products with the smiling faces of children. They made me an old man before my time, he'd say to me many years later. Afterward, jobs got easier and cleaner. Eventually, in middle age, he got a job making false teeth, but his youth was spent at the warehouse. Everything changed, his wife remembers. The dapper young man in the photographs yielded to the man I saw after dinner, haggard, asleep on the sofa. During the Ed Sullivan Show on Sunday nights, when Roberta Peters or Lycia Albanese would appear on the tiny blue screen, his head would jerk up, alert. He'd sit forward while the notes of Puccini sounded before him. Un bel dì. They had a family, my parents no longer dressed in very fine clothes. Those symbols of great wealth and the reality of their lives too noisily clashed. No longer did they try to fit themselves like paper doll figures behind trappings so foreign to their actual lives. My father no longer wore silk scarves or expensive wool suits. He sold his tuxedo to a second-hand store for $5. My mother sold her rabbit fur coat to the wife of a Spanish radio station disc jockey. "It looks better on you than it does on me," she kept telling the lady until the sale was completed. I was 6 years old at the time, but I recall watching the transaction with complete understanding. The woman I knew as my mother was already physically unlike the woman in her honeymoon photos. My mother's hair was short, her shoulders were thick from carrying children, her fingers were swollen red, toughened by house cleaning. Already my mother would admit to foreseeing herself in her own mother, a woman grown old, bald and bow-legged after a lifetime of hard working. In their manner, both my parents continued to respect the symbols of what they considered to be upper class life. Very early they taught me the propiedad way of eating, como los ricos, and I was carefully taught elaborate formulas of polite greeting and parting. The dark little boy would be invited by classmates to the rich houses on 44th and 45th Streets. "How do you do?" Or, "I am very pleased to meet you," I would say, bowing slightly to the amused mothers of classmates. "Thank you very much for dinner. It was very delicious." I made an impression. I intended to make an impression. To be invited back. I soon realized that the trick was to get the mother or father to notice me. From those early days began my association with rich people, my fascination with their secret. My mother worried. She warned me not to come home expecting to have the things my friends possessed. But she needn't have said anything. When I went to the big houses, I remembered that I was, at best, a visitor to the world I saw there. For that reason, I was an especially watchful guest. I was my parents' child. Things most middle-class children wouldn't trouble to notice. I studied, remembered to see the starched black and white uniform worn by the maid who opened the door, the Mexican gardeners, their complexions as dark as my own. One gardener's face, glassed by sweat, looked up to see me going inside. "Take Richard upstairs and show him your electric chain," the mother said. But it was really the vast polished dining room table I'd come to appraise. Those nights when I was invited to stay for dinner, I'd noticed that my friend's mother rang a small silver bell to tell the black woman when to bring in the food. The father, at his end of the table, ate while wearing his tie. When I was not required to speak, I'd skate the icy cut of the crystal with my eye. My gaze would follow the golden threads etched onto the rim of china. With my mother's eyes, I'd see my hostess's manicured nails and judge them to be the marks of her leisure. Later, when my schoolmate's father would bid me good night, I would feel his soft fingers and palm when we shook hands, and, turning to leave, I'd see my dark self, lit by chandelier light, in a tall hallway mirror.